ってもらうんだよ。どうした？どうしたんだよ。だけどお前そんなこと言ったっていい。
いいえいいの。お父さん奥さんおもらいになったっていいのよ。やっぱり私お父さんのそばにいたい。
だけどお前そんなこと言ったっていい。
いいえいいの。お父さん奥さんおもらいになったっていいのよ。やっぱり私お父さんのそばにいたい。
Welcome to Positive Readings. This video is the first of three looking at the work of Kawabata Yasunari. Kawabata is a Japanese author, the first to win the Nobel Prize. His work spans most of the early 20th century. He started publishing in 1925 up until the 1970s, when it is believed he killed himself. I will look at three important works by Kawabata, starting with Snow Country, moving chronologically to Thousand Cranes, and finishing with my favorite novel by him, The Sound of the Mountain. Today's focus will be on Snow Country. Snow Country is often considered to be Kawabata's masterpiece. While I disagree with this labeling, and I would reserve that title for The Sound of the Mountain, I do believe this novel is good, and if not great, and worth your time reading and studying. In this video, I'm going to start off by talking about a brief summary of this novel and some of the themes that Kawabata is preoccupied with throughout all his work. And then also I'll look at some passages within this book that will focus on stylistic choices he's making, and also what I'm calling ambiguities, passages that could be interpreted in multiple ways. The first thing to notice is that Kawabata, he was writing in kind of the prime of the modernist period. So this is the 1920s, 30s. For Japan specifically, he was writing pre-World War II, following through through the actual war, and then afterwards during the U.S. occupation of Japan. However, he doesn't, in none of his works does he talk about contemporary issues. You get some U.S. soldiers that make brief appearances throughout a number of works, and occasionally you'll get a reference to a world event. But for the most part, all his work seems to be somewhat timeless. Also, though he is a modernist, he's also writing about a traditional Japan that's changing. He's writing, like a lot of Japanese authors are kind of preoccupied with the change of culture that's happening in modernization and what is being lost. And I think Kawabata definitely fits that. Is he a traditionalist? I think so. Is he an ethno-nationalist? I don't think so. It's not there. However, he's clearly proud of Japanese tradition and sad to see elements of it changing, and that's something he focuses on. All of his works tend to focus on some aspect of traditional Japanese art. So in Snow Country, this focuses on the tradition of the geisha and the shamisen playing. The Thousand Cranes focuses a bit on, or not more than a bit, on the tea ceremony. And then in The Sound of the Mountain, we get the no drama, the no mass. Another famous work by Kawabata is called The Master of Go, which is obviously dealing with the game Go. So throughout, he seems to be preoccupied with, in part, setting his work around a tradition of Japanese art. Another famous novel of his is called Beauty and Sadness, and that deals with painting, but I won't be looking at that one in this series. One concept that comes up a lot when talking about Kawabata is the Japanese concept of mono no aware, which translates, I think, roughly to the sadness of things. And the idea behind this is that a lot of the work, just like kind of the stereotypical image of Japan, which is the cherry blossoms, and but that idea that the spring lasts for a day and then is fleeting. That beauty is fleeting. Life is always changing, and that seems to be an preoccupation with a lot of Kawabata's work. Whether it's a character, like in the case of Snow Country, who is kind of becoming ugly before our eyes, or whether it is other characters who can't live up to the promises of their youth. Throughout, I would say this is also a modern preoccupation, because it's a preoccupation with time. This notion that the character is installed in time, and time is moving on, and they are changing within it. This is not something that a lot of pre-modern novels really cared about. So in the modern period, we get this anxiety that time is on the go and people are changing, and I think you see that in all of Kawabata's work. So Snow Country is the story of Shimamura. He's our hero or anti-hero. He's certainly not a noble character. So he goes off to a mountain resort in the Snow Country, this area of Japan that receives high amounts of snow, and he goes off and he has this love affair with a mountain geisha, which is essentially a prostitute named Komako. So the story is kind of complexly narrated. It begins with Shimamura on the train, seeing this other character who named Yoko, who is actually living or has a connection with living with Komako. Mutually, they're living at this music teacher's house, at least for some time. And though she is an interest of Shimamura, she's not a fully developed character, and we only get a little bit of her later in the novel. But so the main focus is really Shimamura and this interaction that he has with Komako, and we get is 3 visits, but we start off on the second one with Shimamura coming there in the wintertime, and then he reflects on their first meeting that was in the summer, and then a year later we get his final visit, which ends in tragedy. And that's essentially the novel. So it doesn't have a complex plot, except for maybe in the fact that how it's not linear. But so the main focus is on the characters and how their relationship is developing. And to that end, the characters are, at least Shimamura and Komako, are very well developed, and especially Komako. I found myself, as I was reading this, especially this time around, having a real liking for Komako. She is a tragic figure, but she's strong, and she's got an anger about her for the position that she has in life, and she's trying to fight and trying to get out of that to some degree, and at the same time she's talented. So I found myself really liking her as a character as I was reading this. In a way that I feel like I haven't experienced in a novel in some time. Moving on to the ambiguities and the passages that develop these, I want to look at early in the novel, the first meeting between Shimamura and Komako, which again is told in a flashback during the second meeting. I was going to read the opening of this novel. This is often thought or often talked about as being a very famous opening, akin to, say, Moby Dick's Call Me Ishmael, that kind of opening. I guess I don't have much of a comment or opinion on that. I do think that the important thing about this opening is that it sets the scene, and in this case, this novel really is set in a place that seems kind of timeless, outside of Tokyo. It's constantly, they talk about Tokyo, but this is outside of the modern world. I talked about this in a previous video. This kind of reminded me of Murakami's Hard-Boiled Wonderland and the End of the World, specifically the End of the World narration, where that takes place in a place, kind of an empty winter countryside locale. I know Murakami is not a big fan of Kawabata, but I think he definitely draws on that for that second book. And that is set here in the beginning of the novel. So again, I'm not going to read that part here, but that set up this kind of outside of the city world that we're entering. Another thing to bring up is the train is highlighted. So there our kind of modern world and this idea that people are going to be kind of taken away from the city through modern means, which would be the train. Though maybe you could also look at the train as being a traditional way of, by this point, by later in this, even though this was written in the 30s, but maybe 30s and 40s, that was more of a traditional way of transport. And another thing is there's a man who, again, we don't get him developed much, but he's dying of intestinal tuberculosis, and this was mentioned somewhere where I was reading that essentially that was a disease that came from the West. So I think that could be significant in some of this kind of, I won't say anti-American or anti-Western, but certainly anti-Westernization that's in the spirit of Kawabata's work. So what I wanted to look at here, though, is this first meeting that they have when she essentially comes. He's looking at her. He's not sure. He says, oh, she seems young. His first assessment, Shimamura's first assessment of her, he says, the knowledge that she had aged beyond her years gave him, for the first time, a little of the ease he expected to feel with the geisha. So this idea that we get right there, we get a lot about Shimamura. Again, not a noble character, only feels comfortable when he thinks about her being kind of like a loose woman or a geisha, someone he can use essentially. Shimamura also reveals some thoughts about himself. Again, this is in third person though, so we never get full access to his kind of interior monologue, but we do have the way it's narrated. It's very similar to what we get in a Franz Kafka novel, so it's this close third person. So it says, Shimamura, however, had labeled her an amateur, and after a week in the mountains during which he had spoken to almost no one, he found himself longing for a companion. It was therefore friendship more than anything else that he felt for the woman. And even though, again, this is coming from the authority of the third person narrator, I think most readers can see that, yeah, friendship is probably not exactly what he's feeling, though that's what he's telling himself he feels. So he insults her right from the beginning, and this is kind of this kind of like wrestling kind of dialogue is what we get between Shimamura and Komako throughout the novel. Here's a taste of it. She had barely taken a seat when he asked her to call him a geisha. Call you a geisha? You know what I mean. I didn't come to be asked that. She stood up abruptly and went over to the window, her face reddening as she looked out at the mountains. There are no women like that here. Don't be silly. It's the truth. She turned sharply to face him and sat down on the windowsill. No one forces a geisha to do what she doesn't want to. It's entirely up to the geisha herself. That's one service the inn won't provide for you. Go ahead, try calling someone and talking to her yourself if you want to. So right from the beginning, Komako is upset, probably because we can pick up on this a bit as a reader, that she kind of likes Shimamura, but maybe he likes her as well, but he asks her, call a geisha. But again, it's not just to be entertained, and we get the implication of what he's looking for, and she's upset by that. You call someone for me. Why do you expect me to do that? I'm thinking of you as a friend. That's why I've behaved so well. And again, we see a bit of Shimamura's character. He believes he's behaving well here. And this is what you call being a friend? Led on by his manner, she had become engagingly childlike. But a moment later, she burst out, Isn't it fine that you think you can ask me a thing like that? What is there to be so excited about? I'm too healthy after a week in the mountains, that's all. I keep having the wrong ideas. I can't even sit here talking to you the way I would like to, right? So he wants to get the geisha for her so he can actually enjoy her company after. The woman was silent, her eyes on the floor. Shimamura had come to a point where he knew he was only parading his masculine shamelessness. And yet, it seemed likely enough that the woman was familiar with the failing and need not be shocked by it. So Shimamura is at least self-aware here. He looked up at her. Perhaps it was the rich lashes of the downcast eyes that made her face seem warm and sensuous. She shook her head very slightly, and again a faint blush spread over her face. Call any geisha you like, but isn't that exactly what I'm asking you to do? I've never been here before, and I've no idea which geisha are the best looking. And so they go on a little bit more and talk about, what kind of geisha is good to call. And eventually, he convinces her that, well, if geisha comes, then they can kind of have this friendship instead of it becoming, complicated by romance. She ends up calling the geisha, and he ends up just, having the geisha leave. He's not excited about her. He's obviously interested in Komako, and that's what we get. So really, this is the beginning of this romance. So it's not the most auspicious start. It's a bit humorous, I think. It's not romantic, but it characterizes the rest of their romance, because throughout the rest of the book, it's like I mentioned, this wrestling between these characters. He likes her, but he can't because he's married and he has kids at home. She likes him, but she knows that he's a married man and she can't really have a relationship with him. But out in the mountains, that's where they have their relationship. The next passage I want to look at brings in this traditional music element, so the shamisen. And also this is where we see that Komako is actually far more talented. She's not just this amateur. And this is, I think, where some of the sadness comes, that we see that we have a character here who's essentially wasting her talent. She has talent, she has dreams and desires, but they're not going anywhere. And they're just being wasted on kind of tourists, revelers who come out to this mountain village and just looking for a good time. Throughout the novel, Komako is constantly appearing, coming to visit Shimamura, running away from these parties that she's at with all these tourists, and she's drunk throughout. She's a noble character, I believe, but she's certainly caught up in a bad kind of cycle. But in this scene, she actually comes to Shimamura's room and she plays the shamisen for him. And I think it's fairly difficult to capture the power of music, but I think Kawabata does this quite well here in showing the reaction that Shimamura has. And there's some playfulness. She tries to get Shimamura to sing. He doesn't really want to. She says something about the customers being difficult because he's not singing. She's supposed to be sitting there performing for him. So then she starts to play, and I just want to read over some of this reaction, this narrated reaction that we get here. A chill swept over Shimamura. The goose flesh seemed to rise even to his cheeks. The first notes opened a transparent emptiness deep in his entrails, and in the emptiness the sound of the shamisen reverberated. He was startled, or better, he fell back as under a well-aimed blow, taken with a feeling almost of reverence, washed by waves of remorse, defenseless, quite deprived of strength. There was nothing for him to do but give himself up to the current, to the pleasure of being swept off wherever Komako would take him. So the music basically makes him feel defenseless, like he's just being taken up. She's in control now, and he's quite stunned by this, right? So in the next paragraph he says, "She was a mountain geisha, not yet 20, and she could hardly be as good as all that," he told himself. So he's trying to deny, why am I feeling this way? And in spite of the fact that she was in a small room, was she not slamming away at the instrument as though she were on the stage? He was being carried away by his own mountain emotionalism. Komako purposely read the words in a monotone, now slowing down and now jumping over a passage that was too much trouble. But gradually, she seemed to fall into a spell. And her voice rose higher. Shimamura began to feel a little frightened. How far would that strong, sure touch take him? He rolled over and pillowed his head on an arm, as if in bored indifference. And an interesting point to bring up here is that Shimamura is actually kind of an expert on, or a supposed expert on, Western theater, ballet, even though he's never actually seen a performance. That's kind of the ridiculous, I think in some way making a comment on the ridiculous new experts that are kind of developing in the modern period. Yet here he is, for the first time, it would seem, actually feeling an emotion, and this is coming from the music, the traditional music that this mountain geisha, who he's not in love with, but clearly fallen in love with, that she's playing, that she's making for him. Shortly after this performance in his room, later when she's off at a party, I think she comes back, again, drunk, we have some more of this kind of wrestling dialogue. Another scene that I think is important because it shows the complex circumstances of their relationship. And again, I think it highlights the good dialogue writing on Kawabata's part. So she comes back to his room. He asks her, she's being kind of moody. He asks her, "What's the matter?" "I'm going home." "Don't be foolish. Go to bed. Just let me sit here for a little while." So constantly throughout this novel, she's talking about, I'm going to go home, and then she doesn't leave, though. She kind of stays around. "Why do you want to go home?" "I'm not going home. I'll sit here till morning. Don't be difficult." "I'm not being difficult." "I'm not being difficult." "Then, I don't feel well." "Is that all?" Shimamura laughed. "I'll leave you quite to yourself." "No. And why did you have to go out and run all over town?" "I'm going home." "There's no need to go home." "But it's not easy for me. Go back to Tokyo. It's not easy for me." Her face was low over the kotatsu. And this kotatsu is this traditional heating device that's constantly coming up in a lot of this novel, especially as it's taking place in winter most of the time, but throughout these Kawabata's novels, it's an instrument in the home that you get all the time. Let me continue here. Was it sorrow at finding herself about to sink into too deep a relationship with a traveler, or at having to keep herself under control at so dear a moment? She has come that far, then, Shimamura said to himself. He too was silent for a time. So I think Shimamura is realizing here that she's upset because, she's in love with him now, and I think in this line where it says, she has come that far then, meaning that far in love, Shimamura said to himself, he too was silent for a moment. And I think that line, he too was silent for a moment, reflects something about how he feels as well. Please go back to Tokyo. So that's Komako. As a matter of fact, I was thinking of going back tomorrow. No. Why are you going back? She looked up, startled, as though aroused from sleep. What can I do for you? No matter how long I stay. She gazed at him for a moment, then burst out violently. You don't have to say that. What reason have you to say that? She stood up irritably and threw herself at his neck. It's wrong of you to say such things. Get up, I tell you. The words poured out deliriously, and she fell down beside him, quite forgetting, in her derangement, the physical difficulty she had spoken of earlier. It's important to keep in mind that throughout most of these scenes in this dialogue, a lot of the times Komako is drunk, so this in part explains her erratic behavior, but at the same time, she's upset. She is frustrated. She can't have the relationship she wants to have with Shimamura. And I think this also reflects back on that mono no arare, this idea that these instances are, there might be beauty in them, there might be pleasure, but they're fleeting. And that's, and these characters in some part are trying to get their hands on that, or desperately trying to keep their hands on that, the pleasure, the good elements of this fleeting moment. This passage as well connects to a line that comes later in the novel, when Komako, expressing some anger towards Shimamura as a Tokyo person and how she can't understand these city people, but she says, the Tokyo people are complicated. They live in such noise and confusion that their feelings are broken to little bits. And I think that's, again, a comment on this modernism, this moving away from traditional ways of life and becoming estranged from people, in individuals. And I think this is partly how Komako feels, probably emphasized by the fact that she is isolated out in this mountain village. But she feels like she wants to be part of this world, this Tokyo world, this world of art and performance, but and even love, but she can't really connect with it. She's been kind of cast away. The last passage I want to look at comes near the end of the novel, and this is a scene that is actually talked about in the introduction here. It's mentioned by the translator, Edward Sedensticker, who actually translated all of Kawabata's works, and along with Tanzanaki Junichiro's work, and I think some of Mishima's work as well. And this scene that he mentions, he talks about how effective this simple change in some words, in this case of girl to woman, can have a lot of implication. And so this scene is when Shimamura, knows that he has to leave. They're getting ready. He's getting ready to kind of prepare for his. This is during his third and final visit to this snow country, and he says to her, "You're a good girl," and she's like, "Oh, why am I a good girl?" Back and forth, and then he says to her, "You're a good woman," and she says, "How am I a good woman? A good woman? What an odd person." Her face was hidden from him as though she were rubbing her jaw against an itching shoulder. Then suddenly, Shimamura had no idea why, she raised herself angrily to an elbow. "A good woman? What do you mean by that? What do you mean?" And she gets upset. And the implication here is that by going from "you're a good girl" to "a good woman," he's touching upon the fact that she's already kind of degraded. She's already in decline. And through these 1 year, these 3 visits, he's seen that brief moment of her kind of youth and her and the potentiality that she had, and now that's past and that's not going to happen. He's already decided. He mentioned that he's probably not going to come back, and this is really the climax, but it sets sets it up for the tragedy that comes. So the novel doesn't end there. It actually ends afterwards with the fire. It's this kind of a bizarre ending. I think it's an example of how a great novel could have not so great of an ending, but it won't ruin the novel. The novel's strong enough to kind of survive even its bad ending. I think, the real focus of this novel is on Shimamura and Komako, and that scene I just read was kind of the climax of their relationship in the decline. And it ends with a fire, which seems kind of random and bizarre. Maybe the one thematic connection could be the fact that it's started by a film catching on fire when everyone's kind of watching a movie inside this warehouse. So maybe that's an implication of a kind of the West destroying Japan, similar to the intestinal tuberculosis. But again, I don't think it's not a powerful ending. It's kind of anticlimactic. The character Yoko, who we're not really invested in, she ends up dying in that, but it doesn't have any, I think, real great impact on the reader. It's not Komako dying. The next Kawabata novel I'll look at is Thousand Cranes, so do tune in for that episode when it comes. Thank you for watching Positive Read-Ins. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and subscribe. Reading and writing are choices. Let's make them.